What would you do if your neighbor was secretly recording your disabled husband to frame him for fraud? I never thought I would be grateful for my neighbor's nosiness until the day it saved my husband from prison and exposed the biggest insurance fraud scheme our quiet suburban street had ever seen. My name is Sarah Chen. I am 31 years old, and I work as a physical therapist at the VA hospital downtown. My husband Marcus is a Purple Heart veteran who lost partial use of his left leg and suffers from chronic pain after an IED explosion in Afghanistan took out his convoy in 2018. We have been married for 6 years, and for the past 3, we have lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street in what we thought was a peaceful neighborhood. The house next door belongs to Carol Hendricks, a 67-year-old woman who moved in about 2 years ago. From the moment she arrived, Carol made it clear she was dealing with serious health issues. She walked with a pronounced limp, used a cane, and frequently mentioned her debilitating back injury that occurred at her previous job as an insurance adjuster in late 2019. According to Carol, she could barely lift 10 pounds without excruciating pain and was completely unable to work. I felt sorry for her at first. As someone who works with disabled patients every day, I understood how isolating and frustrating chronic pain could be. Marcus and I would often help Carol with her groceries, and I would check on her during particularly bad weather. She seemed grateful for our help and would often complain about how difficult it was to get by on her disability payments, though she mentioned receiving around $15,000 per month from various insurance claims. But something always felt off about Carol. The first red flag came about 6 months after she moved in. I was coming home from work one evening when I noticed Carol unloading what appeared to be heavy boxes from her car. She was moving quickly and efficiently, lifting items that looked far heavier than 10 pounds. When she saw me watching, she immediately grabbed her cane and began limping dramatically toward her front door. I mentioned this to Marcus that night, but he reminded me that some disabilities are invisible and that people can have good days and bad days. He was right, of course, but the incident stuck with me. Over the next year, I began noticing more inconsistencies. Carol would claim she could not drive to doctor appointments due to her condition, yet I would see her car missing for hours during the day. She told our other neighbors she was practically bedridden, but I would hear power tools and construction noise coming from her house at odd hours. When I asked about the noise, she claimed she was having work done by contractors, but I never saw any work trucks or professional vehicles in her driveway. The situation became more concerning when Carol started asking detailed questions about Marcus and his disability benefits. She would inquire about his medical appointments, his physical limitations, and how much he received monthly from the VA. Marcus receives $4,200 per month in disability compensation, which combined with my salary allows us to live comfortably but not extravagantly. Carol seemed particularly interested in Marcus's activities around the house. She would make comments about seeing him work in our garden or carry groceries, suggesting that maybe he was not as disabled as he claimed. This made both of us uncomfortable because Marcus works hard to maintain his independence despite his limitations, and her comments felt like accusations. Things escalated dramatically last spring when Carol started what she called her side business. She claimed a distant relative had left her several properties that she was trying to sell, and she was doing minimal repairs to increase their value. She said she hired contractors for all the heavy work due to her disability, but she could handle light tasks like painting and cleaning. I began noticing that Carol was gone for long periods during the day, sometimes returning with her clothes dirty and covered in what looked like construction dust. Her car, which she claimed was difficult for her to drive, often had tools and building materials visible through the windows. When I mentioned seeing her loading heavy paint cans, she explained that her contractors had asked her to transport some lighter supplies. The breaking point came in early summer when our mail was accidentally delivered to Carol's house. She brought it over personally, and I noticed she was not using her cane. She walked normally across our yard, climbed our front steps without difficulty, and seemed to forget to limp until she was halfway back to her own house. That evening, Marcus and I had a serious conversation about Carol's behavior. Marcus, being naturally trusting and focused on his own recovery, had not noticed as many inconsistencies as I had. But when I laid out everything I had observed over the past year and a half, even he began to see the pattern. We decided to be more observant but not confrontational. Neither of us wanted to create neighborhood drama, and we certainly did not want to falsely accuse someone of fraud. However, I started keeping a journal of Carol's activities, noting times when her behavior did not match her claimed limitations. In July, things took a sinister turn. Carol approached Marcus while he was checking our mail and mentioned that she had been contacted by investigators from the insurance company about her disability claim. She seemed nervous and asked if Marcus had ever been investigated for his benefits. When he said no, she made an offhand comment about how easy it would be for someone to make false accusations about a neighbor's activities. The conversation left Marcus feeling uneasy, but we did not immediately understand the implications. A week later, we received a certified letter that changed everything. The Department of Veterans Affairs informed Marcus that they had received an anonymous tip suggesting he was engaging in activities inconsistent with his disability rating. The letter stated that they would be conducting an investigation that could result in the reduction or elimination of his benefits if fraud was suspected. Marcus was devastated. His disability benefits are not just income for us, they represent acknowledgement of his sacrifice for our country. The possibility of losing them felt like a betrayal, especially since he has always been honest about his limitations and capabilities. I immediately suspected Carol was behind the complaint, but we had no proof. The timing was too coincidental, coming right after her comment about false accusations. That night, I decided to take a more active approach to documenting Carol's activities. Over the next few weeks, I began paying closer attention to Carol's daily routine. I would note when she left the house, when she returned, and what condition she appeared to be in. What I discovered was shocking. Carol was leaving the house almost every day around 7 in the morning and returning in the late afternoon, often looking exhausted and dirty. She would park her car in the garage quickly, as if trying to avoid being seen. On weekends, I could hear power tools and heavy machinery coming from inside her garage, which she always kept closed. One Saturday morning, I decided to walk past Carol's house during my usual jog. Her garage door was partially open, and I could see inside. There were professional-grade power tools, stacks of building materials, and what appeared to be renovation supplies worth thousands of dollars. This was far more equipment than someone would need for light touch-up work. That afternoon, I casually mentioned to our neighbor Mrs. Peterson that Carol seemed to be doing quite a bit of work on her properties despite her disability. Mrs. Peterson, who is 74 and pays attention to everything happening on our street, shared some interesting information. According to Mrs. Peterson, Carol had been purchasing distressed properties throughout the city for the past 18 months. She had bought at least 4 houses at foreclosure auctions and had been working on them personally. Mrs. Peterson had seen Carol loading and unloading heavy construction materials, operating power tools, and doing physical labor that would be impossible for someone with her claimed limitations. Mrs. Peterson also mentioned that Carol had been asking questions about Marcus and me, specifically about our work schedules, Marcus's medical appointments, and our financial situation. She had even asked if Mrs. Peterson thought Marcus was really as disabled as he claimed. This information confirmed my suspicions, but I needed more evidence before I could take any action. That is when I remembered my professional connections at the VA hospital. I spoke with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who heads our rehabilitation department and has extensive experience with disability fraud cases. I explained the situation without mentioning names initially, describing the behaviors I had observed and asking for a professional opinion. Dr. Walsh told me that what I was describing sounded like classic insurance fraud behavior. She explained that people who fake disabilities often become paranoid about being caught and may try to deflect suspicion by accusing others of fraud. She also mentioned that insurance fraud investigators often look for patterns of inconsistent behavior, documentation of physical activities that contradict claimed limitations, and evidence of unreported income from activities the person claims they cannot perform. Dr. Walsh suggested that if I truly suspected fraud, I should document everything carefully and consider contacting the insurance company's fraud investigation unit. She also warned me that false disability claims not only steal money from insurance systems but also make it harder for legitimate disabled individuals to receive the benefits they deserve. Armed with this information, I decided to step up my documentation efforts. I began taking photos when I could do so discreetly, noting specific dates and times of Carol's activities, and researching public records to learn more about her property purchases. What I found through public records was astounding. Over the past 2 years, Carol had purchased 6 properties in various states of disrepair for a total of approximately $300,000. She had financed these purchases through a combination of cash payments and loans, suggesting she had access to significant funds despite claiming to be unable to work. More importantly, I discovered that 3 of the properties had already been sold for substantial profits. The total profit from these sales was over $180,000, none of which would have been reported to her insurance company as income. I also learned that Carol was listed as the sole proprietor of a business called Henderson Home Renovations, which had been registered with the state just 6 months after her alleged injury. The business license indicated she was engaged in full-service home renovation and construction work. This was clearly fraud on a massive scale. Carol was not only collecting disability benefits under false pretenses, but she was running a profitable business doing exactly the type of work she claimed she could not perform due to her injury. But the most disturbing discovery came when I started researching Carol's background more thoroughly. I found out that she had worked as an insurance adjuster for over 20 years before her alleged injury. This meant she knew exactly how insurance fraud investigations worked and how to avoid detection. Her experience would have taught her how to document false claims, how to present symptoms convincingly, and how to manipulate the system. It also meant she knew how to frame someone else for fraud. The pieces were starting to come together. Carol had targeted Marcus because he was a legitimate disabled veteran whose activities around our house could be misrepresented as inconsistent with his disability. She had been gathering information about him for months, asking neighbors about his activities and trying to build a case that he was engaging in fraud. By filing a complaint against Marcus, Carol was accomplishing 2 goals. First, she was deflecting attention away from her own fraudulent activities by pointing investigators toward another disability recipient. Second, she was potentially eliminating a witness who lived close enough to observe her daily activities. I realized that Carol was not just committing fraud, she was actively trying to destroy my husband's life to protect herself. That evening, I sat Marcus down and shared everything I had learned. I showed him the public records, the business registration, and the evidence of Carol's property flipping activities. Marcus was angry but not surprised. He had been feeling like Carol was watching him, and her questions had always made him uncomfortable. We agreed that we needed to take action, but we wanted to do it properly. Marcus suggested contacting the VA investigators handling his case and sharing our evidence with them. I proposed that we also contact Carol's insurance company directly and the state insurance fraud unit. But before we could make those calls, Carol made a move that changed everything. The next morning, Marcus was working in our backyard when he noticed Carol watching him from her upstairs window. She had a camera with a large lens pointed in his direction. When Marcus waved at her, she quickly moved away from the window. That afternoon, Carol came to our front door with a concerned expression. She told us she had some disturbing information about Marcus that she felt obligated to share. She claimed she had been documenting his activities over the past few months and had video evidence of him engaging in physical labor that violated his disability rating. Carol said she had footage of Marcus lifting heavy objects, doing yard work without assistive devices, and moving in ways that contradicted his medical records. She offered to delete the footage in exchange for $25,000, claiming she needed the money for her medical expenses. This was attempted extortion, and it confirmed that Carol had been systematically surveilling our family. But it also gave us an opportunity. I told Carol we needed time to consider her offer and asked if she could return the next evening for our answer. She agreed, clearly confident that she had us trapped. That night, Marcus and I developed a plan. We would contact the authorities immediately and try to turn Carol's extortion attempt against her. But we also wanted to gather more evidence of her fraud before she had a chance to destroy anything. I called the FBI field office in our city and spoke with Agent Maria Santos, who specialized in insurance fraud cases. I explained the entire situation, including Carol's extortion attempt and the evidence we had gathered about her fraudulent activities. Agent Santos was very interested in the case. She explained that insurance fraud was a federal crime when it involved interstate activities or large amounts of money, both of which applied to Carol's scheme. She also said that extortion was a serious federal offense that could result in significant prison time. Agent Santos asked if we would be willing to cooperate with an investigation, including potentially wearing recording devices during our next interaction with Carol. Marcus and I agreed without hesitation. The next day, Agent Santos and her team set up surveillance around our neighborhood. They installed recording equipment in our house and gave us small wireless microphones to wear during our conversation with Carol. That evening, Carol arrived at our door exactly on time. She seemed confident and slightly smug, clearly believing she had us in an impossible situation. I invited her into our living room, and Marcus offered her something to drink. She declined and got straight to business. Carol pulled out a tablet and showed us several video clips of Marcus working in our yard. The footage showed him lifting bags of mulch, trimming hedges, and doing other routine maintenance tasks. To someone unfamiliar with Marcus's specific limitations, the videos might have looked like evidence of fraud. But as a physical therapist, I could see that Marcus was moving exactly as someone with his injury would move. He was compensating for his left leg, taking frequent breaks, and using techniques we had practiced in rehabilitation to minimize strain on his damaged muscles. Carol, however, presented the footage as clear evidence that Marcus was faking his disability. She claimed the videos proved he was capable of full-time physical labor and that his VA benefits were fraudulent. She then made her demand explicit. She wanted $25,000 in cash within 1 week, or she would turn the footage over to the VA investigators and Marcus would lose his benefits and face federal charges for fraud. Marcus played his part perfectly, acting worried and asking Carol what would happen if they could not come up with the money. Carol became more aggressive, stating that she had already provided some footage to investigators and that Marcus's case was probably hopeless either way. Then Carol made a crucial mistake. She began bragging about how easy it had been to manipulate the system and how much money she was making from her property business. She mentioned specific properties she had renovated and sold, describing physical work she had done personally. Carol was so focused on intimidating us that she forgot she was supposed to be disabled herself. She talked about moving heavy appliances, installing flooring, and doing roofing work without any mention of her alleged limitations or the contractors she claimed to hire for such tasks. The conversation lasted about 45 minutes, and Carol provided enough incriminating statements to bury herself. When she finally left, Agent Santos and her team had recorded everything. But the FBI wanted more than just extortion charges. Agent Santos explained that to build the strongest possible case against Carol, they needed evidence of her actually performing physical labor that contradicted her disability claims. That is when we got incredibly lucky. 3 days later, I was returning from work when I noticed Carol's garage door was wide open and she was inside working on what appeared to be kitchen cabinets. She was using a circular saw, lifting heavy pieces of her current limitations and treatment. On the day of the interview, Agent Santos positioned surveillance teams around the medical building. The plan was to catch Carol performing activities that contradicted her disability claims either before or after the interview. I was not directly involved in the sting operation, but Agent Santos kept Marcus and me informed about what was happening. We waited anxiously at home, hoping that the months of stress and uncertainty were finally coming to an end. What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations. Carol arrived at the medical facility using her cane and walking with her characteristic exaggerated limp. She went through the interview process, describing her severe limitations and inability to perform basic physical tasks. However, when Carol returned to the parking lot after the interview, she forgot to maintain her disabled persona. Surveillance cameras captured her loading heavy medical equipment that had been intentionally placed near her car as part of the sting operation. The equipment included a 40-pound medical device and several boxes of supplies, all clearly marked with their weights. Carol lifted and carried these items without any assistance, moving quickly and efficiently. But the most damning evidence came from Carol's own actions. After loading the equipment, she received a phone call that appeared to upset her. In frustration, she kicked her car tire forcefully with the same leg she claimed was severely injured. All of this was caught on high-definition surveillance cameras and witnessed by multiple federal agents. Agent Santos arrested Carol in the parking lot immediately after the incident. The timing was perfect because a local news crew was filming a story about insurance fraud at the same medical facility, and they captured footage of Carol's arrest while she was surrounded by the evidence of her deception. The arrest was the beginning of the end for Carol's schemes, but the full extent of her fraud was even more shocking than we had imagined. During the investigation that followed, federal agents discovered that Carol had been running her property flipping business for over 2 years while collecting approximately $15,000 per month in disability benefits. Her total fraudulent income was over $360,000. Carol had purchased and renovated 8 properties, doing most of the physical labor herself while claiming she could not perform basic tasks. She had also filed false insurance claims related to her alleged injury, inflating medical expenses and claiming treatments she never received. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that Carol had been systematically targeting other disabled individuals in an attempt to frame them for fraud. Marcus was not her first victim. Investigators found files in Carol's house containing surveillance footage and personal information about 3 other disabled residents in our area. She had been building cases against these individuals, apparently planning to use them as scapegoats if her own fraud was discovered. The federal prosecutor assigned to Carol's case told us that her scheme was one of the most calculated and malicious fraud cases they had seen. Not only was Carol stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from insurance systems, she was actively trying to destroy the lives of legitimate disabled individuals to protect herself. Carol was charged with multiple federal crimes, including insurance fraud, mail fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. The charges carried a potential sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison and millions of dollars in fines and restitution. The evidence against Carol was overwhelming. In addition to the surveillance footage and recorded conversations, investigators found detailed records of her fraudulent activities in her house, including fake medical reports, altered photographs, and financial documents showing her unreported income. Carol initially tried to claim that she had been framed, but the evidence was too extensive and too well documented for her defense to be credible. Her own recorded statements admitting to the fraud made it impossible for her to deny her crimes. 3 months after her arrest, Carol pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $400,000 in restitution to the insurance company she had defrauded. The judge who sentenced Carol specifically mentioned that her attempts to frame disabled veterans made her crimes particularly heinous. He stated that Carol had not only stolen money but had tried to destroy the lives of people who had already sacrificed for their country. As for Marcus and me, the investigation into his disability benefits was immediately dropped once the FBI shared their evidence with the VA. The investigators realized that Marcus had been targeted by Carol specifically because his legitimate disability made him a convenient scapegoat. The VA issued a formal apology to Marcus for the stress caused by the investigation, and they implemented new procedures for handling anonymous complaints to prevent similar situations in the future. Our neighborhood gradually returned to normal after Carol's arrest, though it took time for the shock to wear off. Mrs. Peterson became something of a local celebrity for her role in providing information to investigators, and our other neighbors expressed gratitude that Carol's scheme had been exposed. The house next door was eventually sold to pay Carol's legal fees and restitution, and a lovely family with young children moved in. The contrast between our new neighbors and Carol could not be more stark. Looking back on this experience, I am struck by how close Carol came to destroying our lives. If she had been more careful about maintaining her fraudulent persona, or if we had not been observant enough to notice the inconsistencies in her behavior, Marcus could have lost his benefits and faced federal charges. The experience also reinforced my appreciation for the legitimate disability community. Working with disabled veterans every day, I see how hard they fight to maintain their independence and dignity despite their limitations. Carol's fraud was not just theft, it was an insult to everyone who genuinely struggles with disability. Marcus has recovered well from the stress of the investigation, and his experience with Carol has made him more aware of his rights as a disabled veteran. He now volunteers with other veterans who are dealing with disability benefit issues, helping them navigate the system and avoid the kind of targeting that Carol attempted. As for me, I have become much more vigilant about potential fraud in my professional work. The experience with Carol taught me to trust my instincts when something does not seem right, and I now work closely with fraud investigators when suspicious cases arise at the hospital. The most satisfying part of this entire experience was seeing justice served. Carol thought she was clever enough to manipulate the system and destroy innocent people to protect herself, but her arrogance ultimately led to her downfall. The surveillance footage of Carol lifting heavy equipment while claiming total disability was played at her sentencing hearing, and the contrast between her claims and her actions was stark. The judge commented that he had rarely seen such clear evidence of deliberate fraud combined with such callous disregard for the victims. Carol is currently serving her sentence at a federal prison in another state, and she will not be eligible for parole for at least 8 years. Even when she is released, she will face years of supervised probation and will never be able to collect legitimate disability benefits due to her conviction. The insurance companies Carol defrauded have also filed civil lawsuits against her, seeking additional damages beyond the criminal restitution. These cases are still pending, but Carol's assets have been frozen to ensure that victims can recover as much as possible of their losses. Our quiet street has returned to normal, but the experience changed all of us. We are more aware of our neighbors' activities, more protective of our community, and more appreciative of the legitimate systems that support disabled individuals. I still work as a physical therapist at the VA hospital, and Marcus continues to receive his disability benefits without any further interference. We have used this experience to help other veterans who face similar challenges, and we take pride in knowing that our actions help protect not just ourselves but other potential victims of Carol's schemes. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones living right next door, hiding behind a facade of normalcy while plotting to destroy the lives of innocent people. But it also taught me that vigilance, courage, and cooperation with law enforcement can expose even the most calculated fraudsters and bring them to justice. Carol Hendricks thought she could steal hundreds of thousands of dollars while destroying the lives of disabled veterans to cover her tracks. Instead, she is spending the next 12 years in federal prison, a reminder that fraud investigators are always watching and justice will eventually prevail. Marcus and I still live on Maple Street, but now we sleep peacefully knowing that our fraudulent neighbor can never hurt us or anyone else again.